There was a book that arguably destroyed Oscar Wilde, and in a staggering case of recursive tragedy, Wilde himself wrote a novel which prophesied his own demise at the very hands of the book that inspired the novel. The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is beloved by so many, and quite rightly so, a wonderful book, is thought by many to be a story about a beautiful narcissist who doesn't want to grow old, and so in the portrait of him, the portrait takes on his age and all of his sins and vices instead of him, and he remains beautiful. But The Picture of Dorian Gray is not an exposition on narcissism, though one can look at it like that. It's an invitation to a reckoning. Now, this is a reckoning that broke Wilde himself, and it's a reckoning that all of us actually face today because of something in our culture. You know, here's a book which everyone recognises, 1984. And people laud this book because of it being so prescient, because it predicts the world and the society that, something we inhabit today. But The Picture of Dorian Gray is just as predictive, just as prescient. Because instead of talking about the state, it talks about a deliciously seductive but toxic idea that has embedded itself at the heart of our culture. I would say more so now than it was even in Wilde's day. Now, I'm going to say, I doubt whether you've ever heard a video come from this angle before, because I know I certainly was really eye-opened when I was doing my research for this and spending time thinking about this. So sit back, grab a coffee, and let's investigate the battlefield where Oscar Wilde faced his own doubts before finally succumbing to a mortal wound. While in prison later on in his life, Oscar Wilde wrote in De Profundis about the book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, that it had a note of doom weaving its way through the book like a purple thread. And it's this note of doom which we have to understand if we want to see the brilliance of Dorian Gray in all of its colour. And sadly, this note of doom, Oscar Wilde, after writing it, made himself deaf to deliberately, because I think he just didn't want it to be true. To understand The Picture of Dorian Gray, we have to get to grips with something that really influenced Oscar Wilde, and that's Walter Pater, and particularly his philosophy of art in his book Studies in the History of the Renaissance. By the way, it is a beautifully written book and a wonderful read. Walter Pater was a professor at Oxford. And in his first year as a student, his first term as a student, Wilde got hold of this book, History of Renaissance Art. And he said, "I remember during my first term at Oxford reading in Pater's Renaissance that book which has had such strange influence over my life." Pater's philosophy is the modus operandi of Dorian Gray in this book. Wilde makes Dorian Gray live Pater's ideas without reservation and shows us where they actually lead. But here's something much more important, and that is that his ideas, Pater's, find living expression in the mouth of Lord Henry Wotton, that charismatic, that charming, that paradoxical, devil-may-care individual whom you know he's naughty, but you can't help but like him because of the way he speaks. So it's only by knowing the tenets of Pater's philosophy and then seeing them reflected in Henry Wotton's speech, which has itself a strange influence over Dorian Gray, and seeing Dorian Gray thinking some of Pater's ideas, that we'll ever get to a deep, lovely, sumptuous understanding of the Picture of Dorian Gray. And it's only then that we understand Dorian's descent into oblivion. So what we're going to do now, and I make no apologies for this because we want depth from the book, we're going to take a look, a quick look at Pater's ideas. And I'm going to give you quite a number of quotes because as you took them away, you'll be amazed when they appear again in the book through the guise of Henry Wotton, who is seducing Dorian Gray with the philosophies that seduced Oscar Wilde. Pater's philosophy ultimately posits that the world is full of beauty and pleasures, but time is short, our lives are short, and so we should try to make the most of those beauties and pleasures as we possibly can in the brief time we have. He also makes the observation that morality, social norms and frameworks, society's expectations, often inhibit us from being able to go and enjoy as many pleasures and experiences as we want to do. That's his philosophy in overview. He writes some brilliant things about how to appreciate art. At the beginning, he says that when we're trying to understand beauty in art, rather than looking for some abstract universal principle, which the ancients tried to do and the Renaissance tried to do, he says the first place to start is, what does this piece of art, this beauty, this experience, this pulsation, as he calls it, what does it mean to me? What effect is it having on me? Do I enjoy it? And if so, why do I enjoy it? And he says this is the first point of being able to truly understand beauty. And I would argue he's not totally wrong. Look at what he says, though, then about what real education is. I'll show you directly from the book.
The aesthetic critic then regards all the objects with which he has to do, all works of art and the fairer forms of nature and human life, as powers or forces producing pleasurable sensations, each of a more or less peculiar and unique kind. Education grows in proportion as one's susceptibility to these impressions increases in depth and variety.
Isn't that beautifully expressed? I'll leave you to think about it for yourself and how you take that, but I think he's onto something myself there. But he later makes a comment building on all of his ideas in the conclusion, an infamous conclusion it's called, where he says,
"Not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end."
Now, what do you think about that? There's something in it, and there's something we instinctively find right about it, but it's quite avant-garde, really, because think about how we live. We say that we go through experiences and we should learn from them, and the fruitage of that, our lessons, is what we use to build our life going forward, and that's the value of experiences. But Pater's saying, no, actually, that the beauty and pleasure which we should get the most out of, that itself, just going through the experience, is the real end in life. That's the meaning, not the fruitage, to actually be there and experience whatever we're going through. And this, combined with his "what does it mean to me," is a reasonable subjectivism, rather than making everything objective. But that subjectivism is then amplified by Pater with the idea that none of us can truly know the world as it really is. And this is an idea he's picked up from previous thinkers before him. Pater somewhat correctly observes that any sensation or moment of beauty and wonder that we experience is just the convergence of atoms and events at that particular moment that we're experiencing, and that they're gone before we've even finished processing them. Just look at this.
What is the whole physical life in that moment but a combination of natural elements to which science gives their names?
But that extreme materialism leads Pater to a quite seductive, but perhaps dangerous or erroneous conclusion. It's a conclusion that vaunts individualism and the subjective experience. Building on this idea that we can't know the world as it truly is and everything is just a matter of atoms at any given time, look at what Pater says and notice that it's quite alive and well today.
Experience, already reduced to a swarm of impressions, is ringed round for each one of us by that thick wall of personality through which no real voice has ever pierced on its way to us, or from us to that which we can only conjecture to be without. Every one of those impressions is the impression of the individual in his isolation, each mind keeping as a solitary prisoner its own dream of a world.
Now, Pater adds something to all of this. Haunting his ideas is what he speaks about as the awful brevity of life. And so the question naturally comes up that if we've got such a brief time here, how can we, to quote him, move from point to point, being present at the focus of as many vital energies that unite at one point? In other words, how can we experience the most sensations and pulsations? The world is full of an abundant bloom of beauty and sensation, but we have a finite time. In fact, the way he puts it in his inimitable, beautiful way of speaking is,
"We have an interval, and then our place knows us no more. For our one chance is in expanding that interval, in getting as many pulsations as possible into the given time."
to not find passion and pleasure in every moment is, to quote Pater, on this brief day of frost and sun, to be sleeping before evening. In other words, make the most of life while you can. Enjoy every sensation that you possibly can. But it begs the question, what about morality? Because we're seeing that this subjectivism and individualism, well, you're talking hedonism, aren't you? So what about morality? Well, interestingly, Pater makes this rather startling comment.
The theory or idea or system which requires of us the sacrifice of any part of this experience in consideration of some interest into which we cannot enter, or some abstract morality we have not identified with ourselves, or what is only conventional, has no real claim upon us.
I want to say at this point that Pater wasn't necessarily outrightly advocating for amorality, just do whatever you want. However, his philosophy, his ideas, come very close to that, no matter how much he would try to distance himself later. And Oscar Wilde takes this very seductive, very believable set of ideas and turns them into Lord Henry Wotton. And then Lord Henry Wotton, just as Pater's philosophy influenced students and young men of his day, Henry Wotton seeks to influence Dorian Gray. Now, we've already said that Lord Henry Wotton is this witty, charming, debonair character who has an almost mesmeric influence on us. You can't help but be drawn to him, to smile, because just the way he says things is so beautiful. And there's an appeal to what he's saying as well for all of us. Oscar Wilde said about Lord Henry Wotton, by the way, that he is who the world thinks I am. But now that we've seen Pater's ideas, we're in a better position to understand Lord Henry Wotton. Now, in chapter 3 of the book, Lord Henry Wotton is at a lunch with Dorian, and he's putting forth a lot of these ideas, which are a little bit shocking, but are to do with having pleasure and experiences and sensations. And then a Mr. Erskine says, "Lord Henry, you really must come to my estate and expound to me your philosophy of pleasure over some excellent Burgundy." Notice that expression, your philosophy of pleasure. Now, interestingly, Walter Pater's work, History on Studies of the Renaissance Art, was called A Philosophy of Pleasure by some of his critics. There's a direct tie-in. And so what Oscar Wilde is showing us at this point is that the golden book, as he called it, he called Pater's work that golden book. The Golden Book was no longer just a book, but in Lord Henry, he was sitting at the dining table, actively putting his thoughts into the world, having an effect on those around him. And just as Pater justified the hedonism and the subjectivism of seeking pleasures for Oscar Wilde, so Lord Henry's words have a charming and appealing effect on Dorian Gray. If you remember when they first meet, Dorian Gray is having his portrait taken by Basil Hallward, someone who thinks art is to be created, and we'll come to this idea later. And Lord Henry meets Dorian and he thinks, wow, you are a beautiful young man, you have youth, you have independence, and you have money, all the things we all want in our life. But then he begins to release this aromatic, seductive, but highly poisonous aroma to Dorian Gray by pointing out that isn't it a shame that your beautiful looks and your ability to enjoy the world will eventually fade away with age and with any errors that you make. Just listen to how he beautifully expresses this.
Don't squander the gold of your days listening to the tedious, trying to improve the hopeless failure, or giving away your life to the ignorant, the common and the vulgar. These are the sickly aims, the false ideals of our age. Live. Live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism, that is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol.
This is Pater's philosophy stripped of its scholastic gown and dressed in a silk suit at a dinner table, propounding that we fill this brief interval of time that we have with as much pleasure as possible. And this seductive idea of Wotton's gets hold of Dorian Gray and begins to transform him into seeking to suck the most out of life at all costs. In fact, so much does he come under the thrall of Henry Wotton that he comes out with a direct Paterian quote. Dorian later says,
"Its aim indeed was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they may be."
Did you catch that? Did you recognize that sentence? Earlier, we read that exact statement by Walter Pater himself. And of course, more comes out from Henry Wotton, because he's taking Pater's ideas to their logical end. Dorian does say, oh, you're quite a rogue, Henry. You say the wickedest things. And Basil Hallward says that his comments are dangerous. But nonetheless, Henry Wotton continues to espouse them. Thinking of Pater's ideas about being held back by society, just look at this volley of Paterian quotes or ideas coming out of Lord Henry Wotton's mouth.
Experience was of no ethical value. It was merely the name men gave to their mistakes. I never approve or disapprove of anything now. It is an absurd attitude to take towards life. As for a spoiled life, no life is spoiled but one whose growth is arrested. If you want to mar a nature, you have merely to reform it. Individualism has really the higher aim. Modern morality consists in accepting the standards of one's age. I consider that for any man of culture to accept the standard of his age is a form of the grossest immorality.
There is, to me, a fascinating correlation between Lord Henry Wotton and Walter Pater himself as a person, which I found quite almost dark when I was researching all of this. Henry Wotton, early in the book, muses about how delightful it is to have influence over somebody, to put one's own ideas into the mind of another and see how it changes them, to have total influence. And he says so much to Dorian Gray. He says, "You will always like me, Dorian." And he says, I tell you all the sins that you haven't got the courage to commit. The thing about Henry Wotton is, as much as he espouses these terrible things, this hedonistic ideal, he himself doesn't engage in everything he does. Now, this seems to match Walter Pater himself. Walter Pater was nothing like Henry Wotton in his character. Walter Pater was notoriously shy. He really was worried about public kickback. And so he tended to keep himself to himself. And he was known to have a small clique of young students who he'd regularly invite to go on private walks with him or to come to his studies. And he used to like to share his ideas, often pushing against common morality of the day, with them, and be able to sit at a distance and watch them act out his ideas, a sort of voyeuristic distance which kept him safe, as it were. Oscar Wilde said about Pater, he said, poor Pater, he's basically not got the strength of character to actually live out his own ideas. And then he made a strange comment, not a strange comment, an interesting comment. He said that Pater was distant and insensitive to sorrow. And this really finds itself in Lord Henry Wotton. Just to talk about the effect Pater had on the young men, there is a very enlightening paragraph in The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I'll show you now.
Indeed, there were many, especially among the very young men, who saw or fancied that they saw in Dorian Gray the true realization of a type of which they had often dreamed in Eton or Oxford days, a type that was to combine something of the real culture of the scholar with all the grace and distinction and perfect manner of a citizen of the world. To them, he seemed to be of the company of those whom Dante describes as having sought to make themselves perfect by the worship of beauty.
Now, you make up your mind or not what this can reveal, but it's certainly an interesting statement that Wilde has put into the book, when we've already seen many a quote, really, of Pater's coming through this book. Makes you wonder what he heard personally, privately, in chats with Pater. However, going back to this comment of he was insensitive to sorrow, Pater was insensitive to sorrow, this is quite telling, because this is exactly the kind of gaze that Lord Henry Wotton turns on Dorian Gray when things begin to go wrong, when negative experiences come in. Instead of seeing a friend in trouble, Henry Wotton just sees a case study to examine, something to delight in as he watches somebody engage in as many pleasures as possible. Now, this first starts with the incident of Sibyl Vane. Just to say, if you're enjoying this video, hit the subscribe and like button, ring the bell. But if you really want to help my channel, please consider pressing the share button and share this video with the one person amongst your friends who you think would enjoy it the most. Anyway, back to our discussion. As we know, Dorian enters into his Faustian exchange. He wishes that he will remain forever young and no signs of debauchery or vice will ever appear on him, but they will be transferred onto the portrait that Basil Hallward has made of him, and he'll stay perpetually young and beautiful. This isn't just a Gothic plot device. This is a laboratory that allows Oscar Wilde to explore the idea of whether you can have art for art's sake, whether art can be separated from ethics and truth, which is the traditional way of looking at it. And the first major problem we get is in the account with Sibyl Vane. In case you don't know, or just to remind you, Dorian goes to quite a dank and seedy theatre, which he thinks will be rubbish, but he just wants to experience sensations. While he's there, he sees Sibyl Vane acting the role of Juliet from Shakespeare's play. And he's awestruck by her. She moves him. She's so good as an actress that he falls in love with her and they begin developing a relationship. And then he becomes affianced to her. Now he wants to show her off to Basil Hallward and Henry Wotton. So he takes them along this one night, and she's awful. She's just very insipid. Because she's fallen in love with Dorian, she no longer has to feel such acted love towards the characters on stage, so she's lost everything. And this makes Dorian mad. He doesn't love her for her, he loves her for the sensation that she has produced on him, and now the sensation is gone, he spurns her rather cruelly and storms out. Now later, Sibyl Vane commits suicide because of this, even though there was a sense of remorse by being so cruel by Dorian. And it's at this point that Dorian looks at the portrait of himself and notices that a strange change of expression, ever so slight but cruel in look, has come across his face. And he begins to understand the Faustian exchange. This, although it doesn't show on himself, it shows that our actions have an effect on our character, our soul, as it were, the real person we are inside. And what's interesting is he then says to Lord Henry, he says, I've come to know what conscience is. It is the most divine thing. There's nothing more important. And then he says to Lord Henry, don't sneer, because Lord Henry is like, conscience, whatever. Remember, he said that, being restricted is the most immoral thing. But what's powerful is how Lord Henry Wotton reinterprets the death of Sibyl Vane for Dorian. He says it's a work of art in itself. He says she's only 17, she hadn't even lived, so therefore she hasn't died. She became a vessel for the poet to speak out into the world. Isn't that romantic? What a beautiful sensation you have experienced it. Experience it just as a pulsation in your life. And he says, I am so pleased that I live in a century where we can appreciate this like we do. And although erroneous, because it speaks to the individualism, the subjectivism, which combined seem to make narcissism, Dorian buys into it, and it's from this point that he begins to spiral into trying every single vice possible to get the most out of it. And what he becomes is the ultimate new hedonist. This was a movement of the aesthetes, of which you would say Oscar Wilde was the high priest, shortly after writing this book. And Dorian now begins to epitomize the whole teachings of New Hedonism, prompted first by Pater in his book. At the beginning, the opening paragraph of chapter 4, it just screams New Hedonism, because Dorian is waiting in Lord Henry's sitting room, his lounge, and it's described. Go and have a look at it. It talks about olive-coloured wood panelling, cream architraves. It talks about Persian rugs with long tassels. It names certain books, but then particularly focuses on how they abound sumptuously, voluptuously in great designs. It talks about a Louis XIV clock, and if you think of Louis XIV, it's gold and it's all curved and ornate. This depicts the new hedonist ideal. Everything's there for the experience of pleasure. The colours, by the way, were called natural colours by the new hedonists, and this was an excellent form of enjoying life. That was their colour scheme. But there's one thing in that room that annoys Dorian. Now think of Walter Pater and his ever-present awareness of time. Although the Louis XIV clock is beautiful, the tick of the clock really gets on Dorian's nerves. Isn't that interesting? The one pulsation he can't control is the tick-tick of time passing by. He later talks about how sad it is to think of time bringing ruin to such beautiful and elegant things in the world. Very Paterian. When Henry comes in, there is a significant moment where Dorian asks him for a book. Give me a book to read, because Dorian sort of gets quite bored very quickly. And Henry Wotton gives him something called the Yellow Book. Now that book itself is likely, based on something Wilde wrote himself, is likely this one. I don't know if this can be seen by the camera. There it is. It's Against Nature by Joris Karl Huysmans, if I'm pronouncing that right. This story recounts an individual who tries to suck the most out of life, who tries various indulgences, loves fine art, loves beauty, all those kind of things. And some thought it to be quite a corrupt book. Well, Dorian takes this and it becomes like a manual. He thinks, wow, I want to live that life. And because of that, he then sets about engaging in all sorts of things. He visits an opium den. He engages in immoral sexual behaviour. He ruins the reputation of women. He gets to a point where when he goes into a ballroom or into a soiree, others get up and leave. He just manages, and he surrounds himself with beauty as well. An interesting section is where we see a descent of beauty or a descent of sensation, because he starts off, I think it is, with, it may be furniture. And then he moves to jewels. He wants to collect lots of sumptuous jewels to look at and hold. And then he moves on to embroideries, really great colourful embroideries. After this, what happens is that he begins to look at the portraits of his family, which are ancient. And he knows the stories of all their vices and evil deeds, and he begins going over them and thinking, I wonder how they felt. I wonder what delights of experience they enjoyed through what they did. Then he goes a step further and starts thinking of the tyrants of history, you know, like Nero and that kind of lot, and the torturers and the murderers in history. And he wonders what experiences they felt, because everything has become to him subjective and individualistic. And the point of life is not the fruits of experience, but the experience itself. This is why we've become a narcissist with Dorian Gray.
There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realise his conception of the beautiful.
Now, what he's actually describing, Oscar Wilde, is what modern psychology calls aesthetic anhedonism. Hedonism, the indulgence and experience of high pleasure, and meaning not. So it's the law of diminishing returns with sensation. That's what Dorian begins to feel. After so long, once you're constantly pounding yourself with pleasure, the dopamine, as we know, receptors, sort of shut themselves down so that they're not as stimulated as much, and you get more bored more quickly. And sensations that once gave you pleasure don't give you pleasure, so you must look for higher and higher blasts of pleasure, more intense pleasures for you to feel anything. Now, I can only imagine Oscar Wilde himself had experienced this to describe it. And that's why eventually we find Dorian completely ruining himself. When he goes into the opium den and the brothel, and it explicitly says to take himself into oblivion. Nothing has any sensation anymore. Nothing has any worth anymore. And this, of course, brings us to the picture of Dorian Gray, which is now in his attic, which is now old and cruel and blotched all over with all of the vices that he's lived in his actual life, despite the fact that Dorian is still young and still beautiful. What is the point of this? Well, that image is the refutation of Walter Pater's studies in the history of Renaissance art. That to fill your time with pleasure, to think about how it affects me, to focus on the subjective and the individual, that all is just a brief interval of time that we have. It's all just atoms at a moment which dissipate in a wisp, is what Pater calls it, before we've even finished processing it. And so the image is the refutation of that. In fact, it's what was explained by another professor at Oxford, who spoke to Wilde and had an idea, and that was John Ruskin. John Ruskin followed the very classical idea that true beauty in art cannot be achieved without it also relating to the good, ethics, and truth and usefulness. Now, this is the classical period's ideal of art, that beauty, truth, and the good go together. Pater was saying that's nonsense, you don't need ethics, there is no such thing as objective truth. And of course, that ideal lived out by Dorian has led to complete bankruptcy of character. He's miserable. So miserable, in fact, that in order to get rid of the signs of all his wickedness, he takes a knife and slashes the painting and it instantly kills him. What's Wilde noticing? Wilde is noticing that although he personally likes Pater's philosophy, if you take it to its logical end, you can't separate your behaviour, your character from the physical. There is some strange, inexplicable law that holds over us, which isn't physical, but is moral. And when he's ignored that, of course, he has no friends. He kills Basil Hallward, the one person that loves him. And then, instead of feeling sorry for Basil, he feels anger at him for making him feel sad, for making him feel bad about himself. This hyper-individual, hyper-subjective narcissism leads to absolute ruin. And therefore, Pater must be wrong. Therefore, the end of life is not simply to experience the experiences in the moment, but there is a link between us and others, which requires social conventions, which requires ethics. There is an inherent something in the human being which responds to and needs truth as well as goodness in order to truly see and experience what is beautiful. Now, this is where literature is phenomenal. Literature is not just stories. Today, would you say that subjectivism, and I'm not going to make comment on what I think, just for you to ask yourself, would you say a subjective view of the world is more prevalent than an objective truth? That this is right, this is wrong, or is it my truth, or depending on your circumstances? Of course, there's an element of subjectivism in lots of things, but has it got higher? What about the individual as opposed to doing what is expected of one? Think of the classical period, res publica, or actually that's the Renaissance period, res publica. To do for the community was the central idea, and then for yourself. But individualism is on the rise today. Another thing that is really noticeable, and I wonder if you've pieced this together, you probably have, is that Pater and Wotton and Dorian, at least Wotton and Dorian, they are consumers of the beautiful, not creators of it. It is a very consuming attitude. This is beautiful. I want to experience it. I want to extract from it. Now, think of today. I'm not saying we're all like this, like it's some dreadful thing today. But consumerism is part of our culture. How do people make themselves happy? Retail therapy. We're taught to be discontent. If we have this thing, we'll feel a sense of pleasure and that will make us happier. We talk about being rich. Money doesn't make you happy, but everyone lives as if it does. And so striving, some of the biggest channels out there on TikTok, for instance, are on how to make money, because people think then they can buy things. Why? Because by consuming you get these pleasures. But Basil Hallward, he got his joy from creating, from bringing something into the world. And that expression of the human spirit, that satisfying of something deeper than just the experience, that transcendental idea of contributing outwardly and sharing with beauty rather than taking from it, is something Dorian didn't have, and it made him an ugly character. I don't know about you, but I find that a very fascinating idea. Here's the tragedy though. When Oscar Wilde wrote this, he was already an aesthete. And as you know, he would plunge into what would be termed vice and debauchery and decadence would be the word to use, decadence. He did that the year following writing this book. How extraordinary is that? In this book, he actually makes a character live according to Pater's and the new hedonists' ideals, and it destroys him. And yet the next year, Wilde does the same thing. And he admits as much in De Profundis, that he just wanted to idle away in sensation. And he regrets it at a later point in life. Too late, really. Why did he do that? Well, why do people do it today? It's very revealing of ourselves. I can only put it down to, he didn't want his conclusion to be true. Or, as he wrote in De Profundis, he actually said, morals or moral regulations in a framework don't apply to me. I'm not that kind of character. But this points out that everyone is that character. We all have to fit in. We all have this something above us which is a bit greater, which we have to tie in as a community. We have to relate outwardly and contribute. To say that I'm not that kind of personality is actually to say I'm very selfish and I don't want to be giving. I want to experience everything. But if everyone lived like that, what pandemonium you'd be in. His ideal was very Arcadian, Oscar Wilde, living in that perpetual Greek land of beauty and happiness, of delight, of youth. But that was a false ideal. Some have actually said about Oscar Wilde that he had Peter Pan syndrome. He never wanted to grow up. He wanted to live in the ideal world. He actually said he wanted to be Dorian Gray. Not to be corrupt and ruin people, but he wanted to be able to live that life of just taking as much in this brief interval as possible and experiencing it. But of course, the classical period he was referring back to was built on slaves and people doing the grunt work. Only if you're at the very top would there be a few that could probably indulge in that. So it's a horrible world. But why did Oscar Wilde deafen his ear to his own warning? Why did he go and become Dorian Gray himself? Because, I would say, he thought he had the wit and the mental prowess and intellect to beat it, maybe. But what does it show? Well, it shows Pater's wrong in saying that any experience is just the convergence of atoms and events at a particular point in time. Atoms and science, which is wonderful and explains so much, can't explain the experience of the human being. It can define maybe what's going on in our mind that makes us, sometimes we're feeling pleasure and this bit lights up, but it doesn't tell you the experience. There's something extra that is just the experience, and we need to recognize it. So, the Picture of Dorian Gray. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed researching it. Is not just a Gothic novel. It is not the exploration of a narcissist. It is the picking apart of a highly influential piece of philosophy which would go into amongst the central pillars of 20th century thought, which builds our society, our perspective of what to get out of life. This book showed way back in 1890 that this ideal does not work. And yet, just like Wilde, many of us want it to work. We don't want Dorian Gray to be true. We want to beat it. We want to be able to live the Arcadian ideal of Walter Pater. I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed researching it. I'm not saying that everything I say has to be taken as a given. What are your thoughts about the book and the things that we've looked at now and today's society? Whatever they are, until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.